The old German shepherd hadn't touched food in 9 days. Not the canned chicken. Not the dry kibble softened with warm water. Not even the bacon treats the volunteers saved for the hardest cases. He simply lay there in the far corner of Kennel 17, ribs rising slowly beneath a faded sable coat, amber eyes fixed on the shelter door as if waiting for someone the rest of the world had already forgotten. The December rain tapped softly against the windows of Cedar Hills Animal Shelter just outside Spokane, Washington, carrying the cold scent of wet pavement and pine through the cracked loading bay. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, pale and tired, casting long reflections across the concrete floor. Volunteers moved quietly tonight. Even the loud dogs seemed subdued around Kennel 17. "Poor guy's giving up," one worker whispered while pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders. But the shepherd did not look defeated. He looked loyal. There was a difference. His name on the intake paperwork was listed as unknown. Male German shepherd. Approximately 6 years old. Former working dog, possibly police or military trained. Found wandering near Interstate 90 with an old tactical collar hanging loose around his neck and scars hidden beneath winter-thick fur. Nobody knew where he came from. Nobody knew why he growled whenever another dog barked too sharply. And nobody understood why every single evening, right before closing time, he dragged himself painfully to the kennel gate and stared toward the parking lot like a soul refusing to abandon hope. Shelter manager Linda Graves stood outside the kennel with folded arms, watching him carefully. She was 58, silver-haired, practical, the kind of woman who had spent too many winters rescuing animals people no longer wanted. She had seen abandoned hunting dogs, starved puppies, retired K9s discarded after service. But this shepherd unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. "He's waiting for somebody," she murmured softly. The younger volunteer beside her sighed. "Maybe whoever left him isn't coming back." Linda didn't answer, because deep down, she didn't believe the dog had been abandoned willingly. Outside, headlights swept briefly across the shelter windows before disappearing into the rain. The shepherd's ears twitched instantly. His head lifted for the first time all day. Muscles tightened beneath his frail body. Hope flickered across his tired face so suddenly it made Linda's chest ache. But the vehicle drove past. The dog slowly lowered his head back onto his paws. No bark, no whine, just silence. The kind of silence that forms after too much heartbreak. A few kennels down, another dog began barking wildly, claws scratching metal, but the shepherd never reacted. He kept staring at the entrance, waiting, remembering. Somewhere beyond the storm, tires hissed across soaked highways. Christmas lights glowed faintly through fog-covered neighborhoods. Families gathered around warm dinners while the shelter prepared to close for the night. Linda glanced down at the clipboard in her hands. One sentence near the bottom weighed heavier than the others. Final evaluation scheduled Friday morning. She swallowed hard and looked back at the old shepherd. "You just need a miracle, don't you, boy?" she whispered. The dog blinked slowly but never looked away from the door. Rain followed Ethan Cole everywhere these days. It streaked across the windows of his pickup truck as he drove slowly through the outskirts of Spokane, with both hands resting heavily against the steering wheel, shoulders tense beneath an old sheriff department jacket that no longer fit the life he lived. The windshield wipers dragged back and forth with a tired rhythm, smearing the yellow glow of traffic lights into blurred ribbons across the glass. Beside him, folded neatly on the passenger seat, rested a worn leather leash with faded stitching and a cracked metal clasp polished smooth by years of use. Ethan kept glancing at it during red lights the way some people stared at old photographs. The leash still carried traces of gun oil, pine dirt, and the faint scent of a dog long gone. Or at least that was what everyone kept telling him. 3 years earlier, doctors had warned Ethan he would never patrol again. The nerve damage in his legs was permanent. Some mornings he still woke expecting to hear boots hitting hardwood floors beside a 70-pound shepherd eager for work. Instead, there was only silence inside a one-bedroom cabin tucked outside town, where the walls creaked in winter winds and coffee grew cold, untouched beside the sink. At 37 years old, Ethan had become a man trapped between survival and memory. His wheelchair sat folded in the back seat until he needed it. Pride made him delay using it whenever possible, though the pain usually won by sunset. Tonight, The ache in his spine had already started before he even reached the shelter parking lot. He almost turned around twice on the drive there, almost convinced himself it was pointless. Every few months someone called about an old German shepherd that might have been Shadow. Every time it ended the same way. Wrong markings, wrong age, wrong eyes. But something in Linda Graves' voice over the phone had felt different earlier that afternoon. Former working dog, she had said carefully. Male shepherd. Older tactical behavior. He has been refusing food. Ethan remembered gripping the phone tighter at those words. Refusing food. Shadow used to stop eating whenever Ethan left town overnight for training assignments. The memory settled heavily in his chest now as rain drummed softly against the truck roof. Cedar Hills Animal Shelter appeared through the storm ahead of him, small and tired beneath flickering parking lot lights. The glowing open sign buzzed weakly in the front window. Ethan shut off the engine but did not move immediately. His reflection stared back from the dark windshield. Short brown hair touched with gray near the temples. Unshaven jaw. Green eyes worn down by too many sleepless nights. He looked older than 37. Older than he should have. Slowly, he reached for the leash on the passenger seat and wrapped it carefully around his hand. One more time, buddy, he whispered into the quiet cab. His breath fogged the glass. Outside, cold rain hissed against pavement, while somewhere inside the shelter a dog barked sharply before falling silent again. Ethan finally opened the truck door. The freezing air hit him instantly, carrying the scent of wet cedar and distant chimney smoke. He unfolded the wheelchair with practiced movements, lowered himself carefully into the seat, then pulled his coat tighter around his body. As he rolled toward the shelter entrance beneath the pale parking lot lights, he did not notice the old German shepherd inside Kennel 17 slowly lifting his head again for the second time that night. Warm memories always arrive quietly. Ethan had learned that the hard way. The moment the shelter door slid open and the smell of antiseptic, damp fur, and old blankets drifted toward him, another scent rose from somewhere deeper in his mind. Desert dust, burnt coffee, gun oil warming beneath the Arizona sun. For a second, he was no longer sitting in a wheelchair beneath cold Spokane rain. He was back on active duty, standing tall beneath a blazing afternoon sky, with Shadow trotting beside him across cracked pavement outside the K-9 training grounds near Tucson. Back then, Shadow had been all muscle and restless energy, a 2-year-old German shepherd with oversized paws, sharp amber eyes, and a habit of watching Ethan before following commands, as if deciding for himself whether they were worth obeying. Most handlers complained about dogs like that. Ethan trusted them more. Their first weeks together had been rough. Shadow ignored half the trainers and nearly failed certification after lunging through a practice window before receiving the command. But Ethan saw something different beneath the aggression. The dog was not reckless. He was protective. There was a storm inside him that only calmed around one person. Ethan. By the end of their first month together, the bond between them had become the kind people stopped trying to explain. They moved like partners who shared the same instincts. During traffic stops, Shadow would remain pressed calmly against Ethan's leg until the slightest tension changed in the air. During long patrol nights, he rested his head near Ethan's boots inside the cruiser while old country music hummed softly through static-filled speakers. Ethan talked to him more than he talked to most people. About bad coffee. About sleepless nights. About the wife who left before the job consumed him completely. Shadow never judged. He simply listened with steady eyes that seemed almost human beneath the dashboard lights. One winter evening during a missing child search outside Flagstaff, temperatures dropped below freezing across the pine-covered hills. Officers were preparing to suspend operations when Shadow suddenly pulled hard against the leash and disappeared into the woods before anyone could stop him. Ethan chased after him through knee-deep snow, branches scraping against his jacket, until he found the shepherd curled protectively around a terrified 8-year-old boy trapped beneath fallen brush beside a frozen creek bed. The child survived because Shadow refused to give up searching. After that night, the department stopped calling Shadow difficult. They started calling him miraculous. Ethan never corrected them. Some souls are born carrying loyalty deeper than training. Late at night after difficult shifts, Ethan would drive out past the city limits toward quiet desert roads where the stars stretched endlessly across black skies untouched by streetlights. Shadow always sat upright in the passenger seat like another officer on duty, ears twitching toward the sound of coyotes somewhere beyond the darkness. Ethan remembered one particular night when he parked overlooking the empty plains and rested his hand against Shadow's neck. "You know something?" he said softly while cold wind rattled against the truck doors. "You are the only reason I still believe there is good left in this job." Shadow responded by placing one heavy paw gently on Ethan's knee. No barking, no movement, just understanding. Back then, Ethan believed some bonds could survive anything. He had no idea how brutally life was about to test that belief. The night everything fell apart began with silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind police officers learned to fear. It was late October, just after midnight, and cold desert wind rolled across the empty industrial yards outside Tucson like something restless searching for a place to settle. Ethan parked the cruiser near an abandoned freight warehouse at the edge of the rail district while pale moonlight shimmered across rusted train tracks and broken fencing. Somewhere nearby, loose sheet metal clanged softly against the wind. Dispatch crackled faintly through the radio before going quiet again. Shadow sat upright in the back seat, alert and motionless, ears tilted toward the darkness beyond the windshield. Ethan glanced at him through the divider mirror. "Easy, partner," he murmured quietly. "One more stop, and we are done for the night." But Shadow did not relax. The shepherd's posture stiffened further, muscles tight beneath his sable coat, as though something unseen moved beyond the warehouse walls. Ethan felt it too then. That strange pressure in the air officers develop after years on the street. Instinct. The loading bay lights near the warehouse flickered weakly, throwing pale shadows across stacks of abandoned shipping crates. Ethan stepped carefully from the cruiser, boots crunching lightly over gravel while cold air filled his lungs. Shadow jumped down beside him immediately without needing the command. The dog stayed close to Ethan's left leg, amber eyes scanning every corner of the darkened yard. Nothing moved. No voices. No traffic. Only wind carrying the scent of dust, oil, and rain somewhere far away. Ethan reached for his flashlight and swept the beam slowly across the loading dock. Then Shadow froze. It happened instantly. 1 second, he was moving calmly beside Ethan. The next, his ears shot forward, and a low warning growl vibrated deep in his chest. Ethan stopped breathing for half a heartbeat. "What is it?" he whispered. Shadow pulled hard toward the warehouse entrance, nose twitching sharply. Ethan trusted that reaction more than any equipment on his belt. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12, he said into the shoulder radio. "I may have activity inside the warehouse. Requesting backup." Static answered him. The signal was weak out there. Ethan frowned and looked toward the dark doorway ahead. The metal door swayed slightly in the wind with a slow creaking sound that echoed across the empty yard. Shadow suddenly surged forward 2 steps, then looked back at Ethan like he was urging him to move faster. Ethan tightened his grip on the leash and followed carefully into the warehouse. Inside, the air smelled stale and damp, thick with dust and old engine grease. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the darkness. Flashlight beams swept across concrete floors littered with broken pallets and abandoned tools. Then came the sound, a sharp metallic pop somewhere overhead. Ethan looked up instinctively just as a shower of sparks burst near the far wall. The world erupted into noise. Blinding light swallowed the room. Ethan barely remembered hitting the ground. His ears rang violently while smoke and dust rolled through the warehouse in suffocating waves. Somewhere beyond the haze, he heard Shadow barking. Not aggressive, desperate. Ethan tried to move, but pain shot through his lower body like fire. The flashlight rolled uselessly across the floor, casting dizzy circles through the smoke. "Shadow!" Ethan shouted hoarsely. Another bark answered him from deeper inside the building. Closer now. Panicked footsteps echoed somewhere beyond the haze before disappearing into the night. Ethan reached forward blindly through the dust, coughing hard as the air thickened around him. Then he saw him for one brief second. Shadow emerging through the smoke toward him with terrified amber eyes reflecting the flashing emergency lights arriving outside. And then part of the ceiling collapsed between them. Ethan never forgot the sound that followed. One sharp bark, then silence. For 3 years, Ethan Cole lived like a man waiting for a knock that never came. The surgeries healed what they could. The physical therapy taught him how to stand for short periods with braces and how to fall without panic. Friends from the department visited during the first few months, carrying coffee and forced optimism, but eventually life moved on for everyone except him. The official report stated that the warehouse collapse had caused catastrophic structural failure during an illegal trafficking operation. Several suspects escaped. One officer permanently injured. K9 presumed deceased. Ethan stopped reading after that last sentence. Presumed deceased. Those two words haunted him worse than nightmares ever could. Because no body was found. No collar. No blood trail leading away from the wreckage. Just absence. And Ethan knew Shadow better than anyone. The dog would never leave willingly. Winter settled hard over Spokane during Ethan's first year home. Snow piled along the porch of his small cabin, while silence stretched endlessly through rooms once filled with the sound of claws against hardwood floors. Some mornings Ethan still reached automatically toward the second food bowl near the kitchen counter before remembering it had remained untouched for months. Yet even then, he could not throw it away. Hope survives strangely inside broken people. Every shelter within 200 miles eventually learned his name. Ethan visited them all. Small rural rescues smelling of cedar shavings and wet hay. Overcrowded city shelters filled with barking echoes and fluorescent lights. Retired police kennels where aging handlers quietly shook their heads before he even finished describing Shadow. "I am sorry, officer," they would tell him gently. Most dogs do not survive alone that long. But Ethan kept searching anyway. Rain or snow. Good days or bad ones. He carried the old leather leash everywhere like a promise he refused to break. The shelter workers noticed certain patterns after a while. Ethan never asked about breed mixes or puppies or adoption fees. He only looked at German shepherds. Older males especially. He would kneel as best he could beside each kennel, studying ears, scars, posture, eyes. Sometimes the dogs approached hopefully. Sometimes they barked. Once, a shepherd pressed against the bars and licked Ethan's trembling hand while tears silently rolled down his face, because for half a second, he almost believed. But it never lasted. The eyes were wrong. Shadow's eyes carried something impossible to duplicate. Loyalty shaped by years beside the same soul. Back at Cedar Hills Animal Shelter, Friday morning approached quietly like an unwelcome storm. Linda Graves sat alone in her cramped office reviewing paperwork beneath the hum of an old desk lamp while rain streaked softly against the windows outside. Kennel 17 rested near the top of the stack. Male German Shepherd. Estimated 6 years old. Severe weight loss. Food refusal. Signs of stress deterioration. Behavioral concerns. Recommendation pending. Linda removed her glasses slowly and rubbed her tired eyes. In 28 years of rescue work, she had made peace with difficult decisions. Some animals arrived too broken, too sick, too tired to keep fighting. But something about this shepherd refused to settle properly in her spirit. Earlier that evening, she tried once more to feed him by hand. The old dog barely reacted. He simply stared toward the entrance while cold rainwater dripped faintly from the roof outside. "You are holding on for something," Linda whispered while crouching beside the kennel. "I just wish I knew what." The shepherd blinked slowly but did not move. Then suddenly his ears lifted. Not casually. Instantly. Every muscle in his frail body tightened with sudden awareness. Linda frowned and turned toward the front lobby, just as the shelter door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. Cold air swept inside, carrying the scent of rain, wet asphalt, and something else. Leather. Gun oil. Familiarity. The shepherd struggled painfully to his feet for the first time in nearly 2 days. His breathing quickened. His amber eyes widened toward the hallway beyond the kennels, while somewhere near the front desk, the faint sound of wheelchair tires rolled softly across the floor. The shelter suddenly felt too quiet. Ethan rolled slowly past the front desk, while rainwater dripped from the wheels of his chair onto the polished floor beneath the pale fluorescent lights. Somewhere deeper in the building, dogs barked behind metal doors, but the sounds felt distant now, muffled beneath the strange pressure settling inside his chest. Linda Graves greeted him softly, though her attention kept drifting toward the kennel hallway. "Officer Cole?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded once. "You said the shepherd was older." Linda hesitated before answering. "Yes, sir. Male. German shepherd. Looks like he might have been trained professionally at some point." Ethan swallowed hard and glanced down at the leash wrapped around his hand. The cracked leather looked darker beneath the shelter lights. worn smooth in places from years of patrol work and nervous fingers. "Can I see him?" Linda studied Ethan's tired face for a moment before motioning toward the hallway. "This way." The farther they moved through the shelter, the colder the air seemed to become. Kennels lined both sides of the corridor, some dogs barking excitedly at the sight of visitors, while others curled silently beneath blankets. Ethan barely noticed them. His focus narrowed with every turn of the wheelchair wheels. Then halfway down the corridor, a strange silence spread ahead. The barking stopped almost completely. Linda slowed near Kennel 17. "He has not been responding to anyone," she whispered quietly. "Honestly, we thought he was shutting down." Ethan lifted his eyes toward the kennel. At first, all he saw was shadows. Then slowly, a shape emerged from the dim corner beneath a folded gray blanket. An old German shepherd. Thin, motionless. His sable fur had faded around the muzzle with age, and scars crossed his shoulders beneath the weak overhead light. Ethan felt his breath catch painfully in his throat. The dog remained still for one long second. Then his nose twitched. Once. Twice. Suddenly those amber eyes widened. Ethan froze. Something invisible moved through the air between them. Not recognition yet. Memory. The shepherd rose shakily onto weak legs, every movement stiff with exhaustion, but his gaze never left Ethan's face. Linda stared in disbelief. "That is the first time he has stood up all evening," she whispered. Ethan could barely hear her. His heartbeat thundered inside his ears while the dog moved slowly closer to the kennel gate. Then the shepherd stopped abruptly and tilted his head slightly toward Ethan's right hand, toward the leash. Ethan looked down instinctively. Rainwater still clung to the old leather strap wrapped around his fingers. Without thinking, he loosened his grip and the metal clasp swung gently against the wheelchair armrest with a soft clicking sound. The shepherd reacted instantly. His ears shot upward. A low sound escaped his throat, not a growl, not a bark, but something broken and desperate buried beneath years of silence. Ethan's entire body went still. That sound. Dear God, he knew that sound. Shadow used to make it whenever Ethan returned home after long assignments away from the city. A sound too emotional to be called barking. Almost human in its relief. The old shepherd stepped forward again until his nose pressed against the kennel bars. His breathing quickened sharply while his eyes searched Ethan's face with trembling intensity. Ethan leaned forward slowly in his wheelchair, hands shaking now despite every attempt to stay calm. "Shadow," he whispered hoarsely. The dog flinched at the name like lightning had passed through him. Then suddenly his tail gave one weak, uncertain wag against the concrete floor. Time seemed to stop inside Kennel 17. Ethan stared at the old German shepherd through the metal bars while rain whispered softly against the shelter roof overhead. The dog's tail moved once more against the concrete floor, weak and uncertain, but real. Linda covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "Oh my God," she whispered under her breath. Ethan could barely breathe. Every instinct inside him wanted to believe, but grief had taught him caution. Hope could destroy a man faster than loss if he let it. Slowly, he rolled closer to the kennel gate. The shepherd mirrored the movement immediately, limping forward until his nose pressed harder between the bars. His breathing came fast now, almost frantic. Amber eyes locked onto Ethan with an intensity that made the room feel unbearably small. Ethan's hands trembled against the wheels of the chair. "Shadow," he whispered again, softer this time, like a prayer he was afraid might disappear if spoken too loudly. The dog released another broken sound deep in his throat. Then suddenly his entire body shuddered. Recognition crashed through him all at once. The old shepherd barked sharply, a raw emotional sound that echoed down the kennel hallway and startled every dog nearby into silence. His tail struck the floor harder now. Faster. He pressed desperately against the gate as though every second apart had become unbearable. Ethan felt tears sting his eyes instantly. No other dog barked like that. No other soul on earth knew him that way. Linda fumbled quickly with the kennel latch, her own hands shaking. "Easy, boy," she whispered while opening the gate. The moment the latch clicked free, Shadow pushed through the opening with surprising strength despite his frail body. Ethan barely had time to brace himself before the shepherd reached him. But Shadow did not jump wildly or bark again. Instead, He slowed at the last second and carefully rested his head across Ethan's knees like he was terrified this might still be another dream. Ethan broke completely. A sound escaped his chest that barely sounded human anymore. 3 years of guilt, grief, loneliness, and unanswered prayers collapsed inside him at once. He dropped the leash onto the floor and wrapped both arms around Shadow's neck, burying his face into the old shepherd's damp fur while silent tears shook his shoulders. "I thought you died," he whispered brokenly. "God, buddy, I thought I lost you." Shadow pressed closer instantly, whining softly against Ethan's chest while his tail swept weakly across the floor beside the wheelchair. The shepherd's entire body trembled beneath Ethan's hands, not from fear anymore, but relief. The kind born only from finally finding home after too much darkness. Shelter workers had quietly gathered near the hallway entrance now, watching with wet eyes and stunned silence. One young volunteer wiped tears down her cheeks openly, while another covered his mouth, unable to look away. Even the barking dogs throughout the shelter had settled into eerie stillness, as though they understood something sacred was unfolding in front of them. Ethan pulled back slightly just enough to look at Shadow's face. Age had changed him. Gray touched the muzzle now. Thin scars crossed his shoulders. One ear carried a small tear near the tip Ethan had never seen before. But the eyes were still the same. Loyal, steady, full of trust, so pure it hurt to witness. Shadow lifted one trembling paw slowly onto Ethan's leg exactly the way he used to during those long nights beneath desert stars. Ethan laughed through tears at the sight of it, the sound rough and fragile after years without joy. "You remember," he whispered. Shadow answered by leaning harder into him, closing his tired eyes for the first time since arriving at the shelter. Linda quietly looked down at the untouched paperwork still clutched in her hand. Final evaluation scheduled Friday morning. Her vision blurred too badly to read the rest anymore. The storm finally passed sometime before dawn. By morning, a pale winter sun spilled softly across the snow-covered roads outside Spokane, while Ethan drove home, with one hand resting lightly against the steering wheel and the other touching the old German shepherd curled quietly in the passenger seat beside him. Shadow slept almost the entire drive, though every few minutes his ears twitched at the sound of Ethan's voice, as if afraid the man beside him might disappear again. The heater hummed softly through the truck cabin, carrying the smell of coffee, damp fur, and melting snow. For the first time in years, the silence between them no longer felt empty. Ethan's cabin stood alone, near the edge of pine woods where thin smoke drifted lazily from neighboring chimneys into the cold morning sky. Frost clung to the porch rails, sparkling beneath weak sunlight, while Shadow slowly climbed down from the truck with stiff but determined movements. Ethan watched carefully from beside his wheelchair, worried the old shepherd might collapse after everything his body had endured. But Shadow remained close, pressing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's leg, as though confirming this place was real. Home. Inside the cabin, little had changed over the years. A faded sheriff department mug still rested near the sink. Old records sat stacked beside the fireplace. One dusty dog bed remained tucked quietly in the corner of the living room, exactly where Ethan left it 3 winters earlier, because some part of him never stopped believing. Shadow noticed it immediately. The shepherd froze in the doorway, staring at the worn bed while sunlight stretched across the wooden floorboards beneath his paws. Then slowly, almost reverently, he walked toward it and lowered himself onto the blanket with a long, exhausted sigh. Ethan turned away quickly after that because tears threatened again. Healing did not happen loudly after all. Sometimes it arrived through the smallest things. The scrape of claws across familiar wood. The sound of water lapping from a kitchen bowl once left untouched. A tired dog sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. Days passed quietly after that. Snow continued falling outside, while warmth slowly returned to the cabin room by room. Shadow regained strength little by little. At first, he barely ate more than a few bites before exhaustion pulled him back to sleep. But Ethan sat beside him through every meal anyway, speaking softly the same way he had during training years ago. "Good boy," he would murmur while placing another spoonful of warm food into the bowl. "Easy now. You are safe." And every time, Shadow looked up with those same loyal eyes as though the words mattered more than the food itself. Some wounds remained invisible, though. Certain nights Ethan still woke gasping from dreams filled with smoke, collapsing beams, and one final bark swallowed by darkness. But now, whenever those nightmares came, Shadow appeared beside the bed almost instantly despite his age and aching joints. He would rest his head silently against Ethan's hand until the shaking stopped. No commands needed. No training required. Just loyalty surviving where fear once lived. One afternoon near Christmas, sunlight poured golden through the cabin windows, while Ethan sat near the fireplace adjusting the braces on his legs after physical therapy. The work exhausted him faster these days. Frustration tightened his jaw as one buckle slipped loose again. Before he could curse under his breath, Shadow limped carefully across the room, carrying something gently between his teeth. The old leather leash. Ethan stared at him in stunned silence while Shadow placed it softly across his lap and rested one paw against his knee exactly like he used to after difficult patrol nights long ago. Ethan laughed quietly then. Not the broken laughter born from grief. Real laughter. Warm and surprised and alive. Outside, snow drifted silently through the pine trees while the fading afternoon light painted the cabin gold. Two broken souls sat together beside the fire, neither fully healed, neither completely whole, but no longer lost in the dark alone. January arrived quietly over Spokane. Snow still covered the rooftops and pine branches surrounding Ethan's cabin, but the storms had softened now, leaving behind long, peaceful mornings where pale sunlight filtered gently through the trees like something wholly returning after a hard season. Shadow had grown stronger over the weeks, though age still lingered heavily in his slow movements. He no longer limped as badly when crossing the cabin floor, and his appetite had returned enough that Ethan joked softly every morning about the shepherd eating him out of house and home. But certain truths remained impossible to ignore. The gray around Shadow's muzzle deepened each week. His naps lasted longer beside the fireplace. Some evenings, he simply rested his head on Ethan's boots and stared quietly into the fire like an old soldier remembering battles no one else could see. Ethan understood that look too well. One Sunday morning, fresh snow drifted lazily from the sky while Ethan sat on the porch wrapped in a heavy wool jacket, a steaming mug of coffee balanced carefully beside him. Shadow lay stretched across the wooden boards near the wheelchair, ears twitching faintly beneath the cold mountain air. The world felt impossibly still. No sirens, no radios crackling, no fear waiting around dark corners. Just wind moving softly through pine trees and the faint creak of the porch beneath old wood and old souls. Ethan reached down slowly and rested his hand against Shadow's neck, fingers sinking into thick sable fur still warm despite the winter chill. The shepherd opened his eyes immediately at the touch. Always alert for him. Always there. Ethan smiled faintly. "You know," he murmured softly, "I spent 3 years asking God why he took everything away from me." Shadow blinked slowly, watching him without moving. Ethan looked out toward the snow-covered woods stretching endlessly beyond the cabin. Maybe I was asking the wrong question. The wind stirred gently across the porch, carrying the clean scent of cedar and snowfall. Somewhere far off, church bells echoed faintly through town beneath the gray morning sky. Shadow pushed himself carefully upright, then moved closer until his shoulder rested lightly against Ethan's leg, the same way he used to during long patrol nights when words failed both of them. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath and shook his head. "Still taking care of me, huh?" The shepherd's tail thumped once against the porch floor. Slow. Content. Peaceful. Later that afternoon, Ethan rolled his wheelchair down the narrow trail behind the cabin while Shadow walked beside him through untouched snow. The old dog moved slower now, but he never drifted far from Ethan's side. Never again. Sunlight broke softly through the clouds above them, turning the frozen woods gold for a few breathtaking minutes. Ethan stopped near the edge of a small clearing overlooking the valley below. Spokane shimmered faintly in the distance beneath winter haze while snowflakes drifted silently around them. Shadow lowered himself carefully beside the wheelchair, breathing slow and steady. Ethan removed the old leather leash from his coat pocket and turned it thoughtfully between his fingers. Cracked leather. Rusted clasp. Years of memory pressed into something so simple. Then gently, he clipped it once more onto Shadow's collar. Not because the dog needed restraint. Some bonds simply deserve to be held onto. Ethan looked down at his old partner beside him and smiled through quiet tears that no longer came from grief. "We made it home, buddy," he whispered. Shadow leaned his head softly against Ethan's hand as the last light of day settled across the snow around them. And there in the stillness, beneath a winter sky painted silver and gold, two souls who had once been lost finally rested together again.